Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. So, welcome. Oh, yeah, I can see everybody. Hello. It's lovely to be out here again. I did my undergraduate degree down on the peninsula, and always love an opportunity to come back. I want to talk to you tonight about a fairly complicated topic, which has only been made more complicated and challenging given the recent election. But again, as I'm sure you've been told many times and must be telling yourselves, don't despair. Don't despair. We should just be reinforcing our determination to do something positive. So I've titled this talk Danger Management because I really want to get across what a challenge it is, given that almost any major conservation effort is challenging. It's exceptionally difficult with animals like lions, tigers, elephants. And the subtitle of the talk, of course, is about the fact that Africa is only going to get more and more crowded. So what I want to do is to first contrast what I suspect is a typical attitude in the West towards the lion with the very different viewpoints of people who actually have to live with these things. And then I want to talk about what my colleagues around the world are trying to do to mitigate some of these problems. And then I want to talk about the future because that's what we have to grapple with. So in the West, throughout the 20th century, we've had a very benign view of the lion. Most of us grew up knowing this story about Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. There was a series of books. Here's one that was entirely about the Cowardly Lion of Oz. And we've all seen the movie. And the Cowardly Lion dances with Dorothy and scarecrows and tin men. You know, it's super. And for perhaps a younger generation, there was a Lion King, you know, who was a loving boyfriend. Committed long-term relationship. And, you know, a lot of our kids have had toy lions to hug. Disgraced athletes often displayed them when they would win their events. So that's a Western view in cities where people have a very idealized vision of nature. But I've spent many, many years in Africa, mostly in Tanzania. And if you look at local perceptions, it's very different. Here the good guy is the guy with the spear. Here the good guy is the guy with the club. Here the good guy is saving his community from the lions. And there, in many cases, the only good lion is a dead lion. So why is that? Why that contrast? So I want to open then with why is it that people hate lions to the extent that they glorify them being stabbed, speared, and shot? Well, most obviously, it's because they eat us. And perhaps the most famous outbreak of man-eating lions in recent history were the famous man-eaters of Tsavo, which in the late 1890s probably killed about 35 people who were working on the railroad from Mombasa up to Lake Victoria. Now that's 35 victims. It's been the subject of movies. Michael Douglas. If you're ever in Chicago, you can go to the Field Museum. You can find the man-eaters of Tsavo. They're there on display. And that was 35 victims. But you probably haven't heard that over a 15-year period in Tanzania, nearly 1,000 people were attacked by lions, and 600 of them were killed. My research team was invited by the Tanzanian government to investigate this because it was a real concern. It makes it very difficult to justify the setting aside of land for wildlife when the wildlife can easily come out and attack people. There were years there, in about the year 2000, where nearly 150 people were attacked in 1 year alone. So when we started working on this in about 2005 or so, we followed up. We went to the sites of many of these attacks, and we found a lot of evidence that this had made a huge impact on the local communities. Here's a sign commemorating a lion that was believed by that community to have attacked 40 different people over a period of time. So, being a scientist and wanting to get to the bottom of this, I put together a research group, and we first tabulated where was this happening. Now, Tanzania is a big country. It's about 1 million square kilometers, which is about 300,000 square miles. It's about like California and Oregon combined. And so if you subdivide it out to its little districts, you can see there are certain areas, especially down at the bottom right-hand corner, where there's a huge number of attacks. And kind of remarkably, really, this is the capital city of Dar es Salaam right there. There are millions of people that live there, just south of the capital, all the way down to the Mozambique border. That's the real hot spot for man-eating. 95 cases in 15 years, 185, that's like a dozen cases, that's like one a month for 15 years. A lot of attacks. So why was the attacks distributed in the way they were around the country? And so we did some surveys. We asked people what kind of wildlife they still had in those areas. And not surprisingly, the worst attacks are in areas where most of the lion's normal prey were gone. So along that x-axis, if you've got a lot of prey, then there were relatively few attacks. But if there were not many, things like impala, wildebeest, and zebra, that's where you get these scary places with about 100 attacks over that period of time. So in general, if there's not much for the lions to eat, but there happen to be lions, they're more likely to eat people. That makes intuitive sense. But there was another result in here that was actually more important than that, which is that for one prey species, you had exactly the opposite effect. That where there were a lot of bush pigs, and these are wild animals, they're native to Africa, bush pigs are more abundant in those places with most lion attacks. Why would that be? Well, it turns out that they're crop pests, and they're nocturnal. And the people that live in that coastal area between Dar es Salaam and Mozambique are very poor subsistence farmers. So they have to protect their crops against bush pigs. Very simple, very, very basic shelters in their fields, especially at harvest time. And the lions simply follow the pigs, because that's the only thing for them to eat, and they'll come across a person, and oh, it's a gimme. Okay, it's a pickup. So where there are more bush pigs, there's more likely to be contact with very vulnerable people who then get attacked. Now, I want to pause here for just a second, because I really want to make this real for you. Imagine that you live in one of these areas, and imagine what it's like to walk outside and know that there could be a lion somewhere who might attack you or your family. I just want to give you a couple of examples. This is a man that we interviewed down in that coastal area who is describing about how his wife had been bathing their grandchild in a plastic basin just outside their thatched hut. The woman had just finished bathing the child, had picked her up so she could drive off, so kind of drip dry, when a lion leapt out of nowhere, grabbed the child out of the hands, ran only 20, 30 meters away, and ate their grandchild. The man in the water had been walking home from mosque one evening, and he was attacked by a lion. He then proceeded to put his hands up, his arms up like this to protect himself against the bites. And he yelled, made a lot of noise. So fortunately for him, other people heard this. They ran out. And big enough a crowd managed to scare the lion off. But his hands were so badly bitten, they went septic. and they had to be amputated. Well, we studied this topic, and so we learned some things. So, for example, you shouldn't walk home alone in the dark by yourself. Lions are much more likely to attack you if you're alone than if you're walking in a group. You should carry lights like these children are that we portray on the right there. There are the pigs in the bottom. If you've got pigs in your vicinity, then you should either build a little trench around your crops, around your field, because the pigs, as is often said in Tanzania, the pigs have such short legs they can't jump. Or just build a simple little fence. Anything to keep the pigs out, and then you don't have to sleep in your field, so you won't be so vulnerable. So we put together this poster, we distributed it down there, and as it happened, by the time we'd done all that work, the worst part of this big outbreak had ended. We started while there were still a lot of attacks going on. By the time we ended, it had pretty much over. As you can see down there, very small number. That's over, again, a big country compared to those huge spikes of just a year earlier. But our research had nothing to do with this. We made no difference. What did cause this to go away? It's typified by this story. This happened in 2004, one of those really bad years with a lot of attacks. And the story reads from the BBC News that a dead wife bait traps killer lion. Tanzanian police have vowed to act after a villager laced his wife's remains to catch a killer lion. When Selemani so-and-so found his wife's half-eaten body, he calmly poisoned it, knowing the lion would return for the rest of its meal. Lion eats a bit of poison, you're gone. Once that was understood by the local communities down there, they would not only poison the half-eaten remains of their loved ones, but also of livestock that might have been attacked by lions, or even bush pigs that had been half-eaten and abandoned during the daytime. Poison is incredibly cheap. This is a rat control agent, that is a freelance rat poison salesman. In Dar es Salaam, it costs just a few pennies to buy enough poison to kill a lion. So even the poorest people can rid themselves of a man-eating outbreak simply by using poison. So, people hate lions because they eat us. They also eat our livestock. Now that I took off the internet, and I believe everything I see on the internet. And no, it's just as fake as most of the election news, but never mind. Okay, I want to move now from those rural farming areas to more of a pastoralist area. Pastoralists are where people keep livestock for their livelihoods. One of my students, Tanzanian, was looking at lions in Tarangire National Park. This is still in Tanzania. And Tarangire National Park is a fairly narrow area right here. It's still pretty good size. It's about nearly 35 kilometers across. But that's not a huge amount of area when we're talking about lions. And he collared using these GPS collars where they give you a location every day or so. And he thought he was collaring lions who were going to spend all their time in the parks, but it turned out that they leave the park for long periods of time. Tarangire is one of many ecosystems in East Africa where the prey are migratory. They come into the national parks during the dry season when water is scarce overall, aggregate around the rivers, but once it rains, they disperse, trying to get away from the lions and other predators. Well, the lions don't just sit there twiddling their claws until 6 months later. They follow. But they only follow as far as they need to get something to eat, and it doesn't have to be wildlife. So these dotted circles around, those are villages. Those are Maasai villages around Tarangire. And so you can see that these lions just get out to where they're pretty close to some of those villages, and they start taking livestock. Local people don't like that. And so Kasui, my student, looked at a number of different villages, figured out how many lions attacks they were suffering in each village over a period of time, And then how many lions got killed in retaliation? And the exchange rate's 1 lion for each cow. Tanzania has 10 million cows, maybe 10,000 lions. So these are not favorable odds. And not surprisingly, over the first few years of his study, this went way down. That's the lion population that he was studying. So they lost about 25% only over about a dozen years. So the impacts that the local people have on these lions can be substantial. And it's not just lions leaving the park. Across the border in Kenya, in Masai Mara, it's often been seen that Maasai herders will bring their livestock inside the park during hard times of the year where the livestock mingle with the wildlife. Good grazing in there. There's overgrazing outside the park, so they bring their livestock inside. Well, it doesn't matter that this is supposed to be a national park. This is supposed to belong to the lions. If a lion happens to catch a cow inside the park, they'll use Furadan, an incredibly powerful insecticide that is lethal to lions. Again, poison. Again, very cheap. Again, a major source of lion conservation declines. Okay, so that's the bad news. People don't like lions. They threaten their lives, they threaten their livelihoods. So how do we keep lions out of trouble? I think even post-election, I'm in a blue state, so it's safe to talk about the barrier method. I couldn't say that in Oklahoma. By the barrier, of course, I mean the fence. And what I want to show you now is how we come to realize the importance of wildlife-proof fencing in conserving lions. Now, but first I just need to give you a little bit of scientific background. I wanted to look at how lions fared all across Africa, and Africa is not a country. It's a continent, and it has enormous variation in its habitat, just like the US, which is a country, but never mind. Some places, like the Namib, are pretty empty of meat. And so if you have lions live there, they have to wander over huge areas to get enough to eat. Other places, like the Serengeti, are a meat locker practically. There's just so many wildebeest and zebra there. Okay? So expect to find a lot more lions in rich habitats than we do in very poor habitats. Okay? So some colleagues of mine and I have been able to work out, if we know something about how much prey is there, how many lions would you expect to see? Okay? And we can also use rainfall and the soils as surrogate measures. One way or another, we can predict how many lions there ought to be, and that's that red line and that graph across different habitats. And you can see that some of the little dots are above that red line, so that for a given amount of prey, there's more lions, and some dots are below. So you don't have as many lions as maybe you should, given the amount of food. Okay? So if we look at where actual population data land either side of that trend line, we get something like this. And it's really quite striking that if reserves have got a wildlife-proof fence all the way around them, they're in those black squares at the top, and they're as many lions as you'd predict, if not more. Okay, lions do really well if you separate them physically from people. They're not eating their families, they're not eating their livestock. But if you don't fence it, and it doesn't matter how big this area is, then we see they're really far below what there should be, below what we would call the carrying capacity. Okay? Not only are they below the carrying capacity, but if we look at what kind of growth rate these populations are showing, if it's negative, so it's the left of that vertical line, they're all declining. So all those red dots are declining populations of lions in unfenced areas, whereas all the fenced ones, again, are fine and no problem. Okay? If we put these two together, what we see going into the future is that if you really want to protect your lion population, you really ought to put a fence around it. Okay? If you can't, chances are pretty good, like about 50%, that a given population will be below down verging on extinction within the next 20 or 30 years. So about half of the lion habitats, the unfenced ones that we've got data for, we expect to largely be extinct by the middle of this century because they're so far below their carrying capacity and they're declining. Okay, so the barrier method does work, but it's not a perfect solution for everywhere. What else can you do? The other I like to call perpetual vigilance. This takes into account the traditional livestock husbandry techniques of pastoralist societies where you have boys, young men, who are out with the livestock from morning until dusk, okay? And the reason we have to really think about this is that if we look across Africa, where the lions still exist, there aren't that many, and they're in the darker brown splotches across Africa. Tarangire's not the only one that has that migratory system. If we were to put a fence around the boundary of Tarangire National Park, you'd block the migration, you'd kill it, you'd destroy it. So you can't fence it. And that's true of a lot of places in East Africa. You have the migration around Amboseli and various other places up there besides just Tarangire. So, a number of conservation organizations, most notably Panthera, which is based in New York, and the National Geographic Big Cats Initiative, which is in DC, have sponsored a number of efforts to come to some sort of resolution in these areas that cannot be fenced. So there's living with lions. The idea is that instead of having the Maasai be cattle killers in retaliation, you give them radio tracking equipment, pay them a bit, and they'll keep track of where the lions are with the radio collars, and they'll warn their friends, whoa, you've got to be extra careful because this lion might attack the cattle now. Okay, pay attention. There's lion guardians. There's Iwaso lions. These are all in Kenya. African People and Wildlife, that's in Tanzania. All of these have the same basic principle that let's bring the Maasai on board with lion conservation because there's some money for their salaries. There's some status involved with being involved with this sort of thing, and try to change people's basic hostility towards lions in a completely different direction. Now, the most famous of these studies is the one on the top right. That's Lion Guardians. That's in Amboseli in Kenya. And looking at the data, that red horizontal line is how many lions we expect to see in Viracani. And that green vertical line there, here, this is when they started the Lion Guardians project. And at that point, there was only about one lion per 100 square kilometers in this area, when there should have been about 6 or 7, so it's way below the carrying capacity. And after a couple of years of trying Lion Guardians, it looks promising. So the most recent data I've seen, which is from about 3 years ago, was showing that it's looking like it's got signs of recovery. Okay? So that's promising, but only just because it's really early days. And even though the lions are coming up, they're still pretty far below significant numbers. Okay, so it's still pretty scarce. The reason I'm cautious about this is from a very big project that was set out in Namibia, jointly implemented by Worldwide Fund for Nature with funding from, by USAID. This went on for 16 years, added up to millions of dollars. And again, the idea was to bring local people on board, make them friends of conservation, have them much more willing to put up with the risks of living with lions, seeing them as an asset for the communities rather than a liability. And of all the studies we had, of all the data we had of unfenced reserves, this is unfenced, this is the only one that showed a really strong positive increase, okay, over about a dozen-year period. I mean, that's really pretty impressive. And this is largely because of this LIFE program funded by AID and WWF. But, you knew there was a but coming, it's pretty easy to start these things when lions are so rare, everybody's forgotten about them. But as the lion population recovered, now they're a menace again. They're starting to take so many livestock, In 2011, they poisoned them. And I mentioned earlier, there's projects in Kenya. One of the most famous lion prides in all of Africa, featured on BBC television year after year, the marsh lions in the Mara, poisoned in December. In Birikani, the lion guardians, their most famous lion that they protected, poisoned in December of 2015. So as these animals get more common again, they get into trouble, boom, it's a problem. So even though all these things look promising in the short term, I don't know how well they're going to work in the long term. Okay, so what's next? Or are we depressed yet? Okay, I'm going to try to pull you out of it. First thing we have to do is to get realistic, okay? And I get yelled at a lot by everybody, not just my family. One of the things that pisses people off is I keep saying, well, if you want to really save lions, you've got to use fences, okay? A lot of conservationists, and some with good reason, because of those migratory systems I talked about, don't want to see fences, and they've got a point. But there are other places that they're not fenced yet, and why on earth would you subject local communities to these risks, right? And so what I want to do is to emphasize absolutely the one true amazing success story for African lion conservation, and that's in South Africa. By the 19-teens, there were lions only in two areas in all of South Africa. That looks fairly bleached out on the screen, but this is the border with Mozambique, so this is Kruger National Park, this long, thin part here. And this over here is kind of a peninsula sticking up into Botswana. Okay, so surrounded by Namibia and Botswana. Those are the only two places that had lions. Okay? These areas didn't, none of these others did. There are now more lions in South Africa than there were 100 years ago. Far more lions now than there were 100 years ago. They're all over the place. All those other red dots are lions that have been added, are now thriving throughout the country in the last 25 years. And it always started the same way. If you want to bring lions back, the first thing you do is build a fence. First thing you do is you go around and you talk to the local people. And you say, you know, we've got this really nice opportunity to bring wildlife back to your region, to your district. Would you like that? Come look at the fence we built. This fence will protect you against the lions. This fence will protect you against the elephants. This fence will mean that your lives will be very little affected in terms of danger once we bring these species back. And people say, yes. Okay? So there are lions all over the place now, thanks to the fencing. Now, if you look in different parts of the world, Asia traditionally has been rather amazing in their tolerance for large carnivores. This famously is a leopard in Bombay. What the? Leopard in Bombay. Well, people like to point that out, but what they don't often tell you is this is often what happens. There's attacks. Children get eaten in the parks in Bombay. The authorities then take the leopard or move it off to a different part of the country and don't tell anyone that they've released a man-eating leopard near their community. And then the leopard eats somebody. And it's like, what are you thinking? So in fact, tolerance for wildlife in India is crashing really fast. It just ain't the same as it used to be. And so far, there's no fences to speak of in India, but they're coming. And this is back in Africa, and in this area, there's no conflict between the leopards and the local communities. None, because the fence is so effective. Now, I just want to emphasize it's not just Africa where people hate wildlife. India has received tens of millions of dollars. Tigers forever, the tiger landscape, all of these things. And yet, in these areas that receive all this money, people will build their own fences so that they can feel safe trying to harvest the sugarcane. And if the tiger gets caught in the fence and dies, hooray. Good, they don't care. They just want to be safe. If the electric fence electrocutes the tiger, yippee, they're safe. They don't care if the leopard gets impaled on the fence or it gets impaled on another fence. Despite all the efforts to bring to the table local communities as partners in conservation in these unfenced areas in India, almost every place is unfenced, millions of dollars have been spent. That tiger on the bottom right went into one of the villages that's been the recipient of the most money, walked down the main street in the middle of the day, people beat it to death with sticks. So winning hearts and minds doesn't work when those hearts and minds can be eaten by tigers and lions. It's too scary, it's too risky. So where places can be fenced, we really have to be serious about it. Okay, so one of the future research projects, one of the things I'm working on right now with a colleague in Finland, is we recognize that you can't always fence everywhere. But there are a lot of other places that could be fenced, and they should be fenced. I think there's a moral imperative to protect people against these dangerous animals. And it's by far the most effective conservation technique we know. Okay, so that's fences. Secondly is, as Barbara mentioned beforehand, there was a little kerfuffle last year about hunting of a particular lion. And this is another thing that people yell at me at. I make everybody mad. If I haven't made you mad yet, wait. Just wait. Okay, the deal about hunting that's actually kind of good is it is subject to regulations. Within countries, there's supposed to be strict limits on what can be shot, and also imports of trophies to our country from other countries, that is subject to regulation as well. But let's talk about sport hunting for a minute. The problem with sport hunting is that if maybe you've got a cousin or a nephew or an uncle or a sister that likes to shoot things, and we have a lot of hunters in this country that do make legitimate contributions to conservation. There is, for example, Ducks Unlimited, and an awful lot of wetland in this country has been protected because of duck hunters. There's a lot of areas where we have massive amounts of deer because of hunters, okay? And when it comes to hunting mammals, and you hunt a male, which is the tradition in sport hunting, you got the big rack of horns or antlers or whatever. Basically, you're shooting a male who mostly just finds his wife at a singles bar for a one-nighter, and that's it, okay? The problem was when you're shooting carnivores, these are family men, you know? And so male lions are really important to their pride, to their family, because the male protects his own offspring against replacement males. New males will not tolerate being stepfathers. The first thing they do when they take over pride is they kill all the babies. That causes the females to come into heat within a few days, and they replace the step cubs with their own biological children, okay? So if you're a hunter and you shoot one of these resident males, you're going to have a consequence that could ripple out to affect the entire population. So we published a paper a few years ago in Nature that first presented this pattern here. And one of my graduate students was very smart because she said, well, you know, it really depends on how old the lions are when they're shot. And I think there are a few men in here that are nearly as old as I am, maybe not. But even if you're 2/3 my age, you've probably finished with your family, right? Kids are off to college and everything. And you could be harvested at this point. Wouldn't make any difference to the population, you know. Sorry. So, but there's a few young men in here too, and if you're just starting your family, that would be bad. Okay, we got to look after the younger men because they're still looking after their families. And so in lions, the young men would be like 3 or 4 years of age. Okay, even 5. They're there, but by the time they're 6, it takes them about 4 years to take over pride, and then it takes 2 years to look after their cubs before they can then send them off to college and retire to Arizona or whatever. So if you if you shoot lions when they're too young and you shoot too many of them, you're going to have this constant chaos, because every time a female gets pregnant and has cubs, her husband's shot, and a new male comes in, kills her kid, and she's never able to have any offspring recruited into the adult population. Whereas if you wait until they're older, they've had their family, you can let them out, okay? Now, I go into this because the hunting industry didn't really have a very good idea what a trophy animal would be. You'd think a trophy animal would be one with, the great big antlers, big horns, big mane. Well, when we started doing this work, we were pretty shocked that these were being advertised online. You want to come hunt and have a really cool trophy lion like these guys? Now, those are babies. No, they're tweens. They're like middle school lions. They're 2 years of age. In every one of those pictures, I've cropped off the grinning smile of the hunter, who's very pleased that he got his trophy, okay? They're shooting them, that's 2 years of age, okay? And we emphasize that if you shoot too many, even if they're 3, you could have terrible effects on the population, okay? Now this is all based, we did this in our computer, so you guys have Silicon Valley, but I have Silicon Serengeti. And so we simulated what would happen if you had these different hunting strategies. But I got real data later, and it turns out that, yes, if people were shooting too many lions, then that would lead to real drop-offs in the lion populations. It was really having a negative effect that we can measure. This is across a bunch of different countries in Africa, so they shot more intensively, the population was going down. And then I did it within Tanzania, and we found that, whoa, above a certain amount, they were having a negative effect on the population. And some of and that turned out to be that you only had to, if you could shoot one lion per 1,000 square kilometers per year, that's not too bad. The population can absorb that. But in some places, they were shooting 10 times as many as was safe. But they had no idea, because nobody ever thought about this, that they could even overhunt lions. There's sort of a view within the hunting industry that there's an inexhaustible supply of nature. So how could they possibly be overhunting? And then they're wondering why there aren't as many lions this year as there were last year. So largely as a result of this work, the good news is that the federal government, which after all is for the public good, it is, and it can do good things, even internationally, it can, okay? They put the lion on the Endangered Species Act, listed it as of December last year, and they're much more strict now in allowing imports from African countries of lion trophies. So that is limiting now the impacts that trophy hunters are having. Okay, but the much bigger thing, and this is the thing I really wanted to talk about and why I really wanted to come and see everyone, is I want people to have a realistic assessment of what the challenges are. This is the same data, is a population of lions above, like those black dots in the fenced areas, they're doing great. How much are people spending in protecting these areas, and what consequence does it have on how well the lion population is doing? So we can first talk about, fencing's great, but most places in Africa are not South Africa. There's 1 or 2 fenced reserves in Kenya, in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, but everywhere else, they're all unfenced. So they're all like those red dots, okay? And to get a reasonably healthy lion population, you have to spend a lot of money in those unfenced areas, okay? So to get the population at about half of its expected, that ain't great, but it's a lot better than in some places, you need to spend about $2,000 per square kilometer per year on management. That means anti-poaching, habitat protection, maintaining the integrity of these parks in Africa. About $2,000 per square kilometer per year. And if you look at this, you may have heard the term paper parks. A paper park exists on a map, but when you go there, it's like, where is it? Because there's no rangers, there's no wardens, there's nothing. So those on the far left, that's what it actually looks like in a paper park. Lion populations are only about 10% of what they ought to be. And people are spending only like $10 per square kilometer. No wonder there's no lions, because there's nothing protecting them, okay? But as you put your investment up, you get more lions. But it's a lot of money, okay? Now, here's a scary thought. This now separates out these different reserves according to how many people live in the vicinity, okay? If the population density is really low, then you get more lions per buck, okay? So you're higher above that red line for a given amount of money. But if it's high population, you're below it, okay? So it's much more expensive. It makes sense. You have to spend a lot more to protect lions when there's a lot more people they could get in trouble with, okay? And these costs are only going to grow, okay? So right now, we could say it's about 2,000, but as the human population in Africa continues to grow, we can expect that amount to be shoved over to the right, and it's going to be much more expensive than it is now. Because look at the impact that we're having on the planet as a whole. Our human imprint is enormous. In Asia, in particular, with very high population densities, not quite so bad in Africa, but given the rapid population growth in Africa, by 2060, sub-Saharan Africa is predicted to have the same population density as South Asia. It'll be the same as India all across Africa, okay? So, it's going to cost billions of dollars to do this. This is my final big important point. We need a massive amount of money going into this. Where is this money going to come from? Okay? These fenced reserves actually give you good bang for buck because for a given amount, they're always doing really, really well. But it's a lot of capital cost to build a fence in the first place. Now, how are these parks paid for? And now I'm going to give you something that you may not know, and it's really important in thinking about how we're going to approach this problem in Africa. Africa's parks are funded by entrance fees. If you go to the Serengeti, if you go to Ngorongoro Crater, if you go to Masai Mara, you pay $100 or however much a day to go in there, okay? But there's only about half a dozen parks that earn enough to make that $2,000 per square kilometer in all of Africa. Come floods or whatever. Oh, and you guys have a drought. Oh, sorry. Don't worry, it's okay. Yeah, it's fine. It's all right. Okay, so only half a dozen parks generate enough money to get that 50%. That's it, okay? Now I want you to think about our parks for a minute. How many of you have been to Yellowstone in the last year or so? Last year, yeah? How much did you pay to go in? Yeah, something like that. Well, I went there with my wife this summer, and I spent $15 because I'm above the age of 62, and that's good for life, for $12. I could go live in one of these places, okay? So a lot of these places, they're really cheap. They're like 15 bucks. It's crazy how cheap it is, okay? Well, that's because you guys that didn't go to Yellowstone, you helped pay for it, right? Remember, our government works for the public weal, all right? Government is a good thing, okay? Sorry, but it is. Right, so we all pay for it, okay? So here's the problem with ecotourism. If you have a place like the Serengeti and Ngorongoro, and you try to do it with phototourism, that's cool. It could. But there's 11 national parks in Tanzania, and only Serengeti and Kilimanjaro make much money, enough to cover those costs, okay? They actually subsidize the other 9 parks. So if you've been to Tarangire, Manyara, Ruaha, any of those other places, they're not being supported fully by the attendance, but by the receipts coming into a few places elsewhere. So none of them are getting enough money to protect themselves fully, okay? And hey, they're pretty crowded. Those really popular parks are like parking lots, okay? And well, one solution would be to make it more expensive to go for phototourism, but the problem with tourism is it's a competitive industry. And so you've got to compete against Disneyland or whatever else. So the prices are not going to go up to what they need to be in order to make it pay off, okay? I want to get back to sport hunting for a minute. I've already pointed out that this can be negative for the whole population, but it also pays a phenomenally small amount of money. Yes, it does. So I wrote a little paper a couple of years ago about this, again, pissing off people. And I just said, look, this doesn't generate much money. The hunters want you to believe that their fees make it worthwhile for local people to suffer the risks of living with lions or things. Now, again, you may have seen the news in the last month or so, last year or so. Cecil's on the left. The dentist happens to be from Minnesota, and people were pretty upset there. I did a couple of interviews after this, and they're Midwesterners. They're frugal. They're modest. It's Lake Wobegon, right? And they thought it was so ostentatious and really just disgusting that this dentist had spent $50,000 to shoot a lion. And I said, well, if you figure out how much money it takes to raise a lion for the 6 years before it's safe to harvest him, right, the amount of land he needs, he should have spent $1 million. And if that whole $1 million had gone to the conservation of the park, we could talk about it. But out of that $50,000, 3/4 of it's lost to corruption, okay? So that barely covers 1% of what Cecil was actually worth, or what it cost to produce a Cecil, okay? So here's the problem. Africa is the poorest continent on earth. And at independence, African countries were told by the departing colonial powers, we set up these parks for you guys, but now you have to run them, and wildlife should pay its own way, okay? They can't run their parks like we do. There cannot be a senior pass for $12 for the rest of their life, okay? Africa doesn't have the tax base to cover the costs of wildlife management, okay? And African wildlife inflicts the heaviest costs on humans. I mean, look, you've been to national parks here. How many of you could have been eaten by any of the animals in any of our national parks? Well, maybe Glacier might have a grizzly, but nowhere else, right? Our parks protect rocks. They're really great rocks, They're fabulous rocks, but they don't eat us, And they've got to deal with the challenge of protecting lions, elephants that actually leave the park and go outside and cause mayhem, okay? Now, Africa's parks are not completely on their own. They've been recognized internationally. This is a list or a map showing the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The ones in green are the natural World Heritage Sites. That would include the Serengeti and Ngorongoro, Kruger Park, a number of other wildlife places, okay? There's also cultural ones like Stone Town in Zanzibar and a few other places like that, okay? And a lot of those in red, they said, oh, they're threatened because there's not enough going into the maintenance for it. Do you know how much money a World Heritage Site gets from UNESCO? How much do they contribute to each site each year? You know how much money that is? It's really simple. Zero, nothing, not a penny. It's just there for branding. It's for advertising only. They get no budget at all from UNESCO, okay? This is Africa. This is where the elephants are, okay? This is where you got the big things like buffalo. This is the zebra, hippos, the crazy things, the eland leaping around, and big bird, big bird, giraffe, even if they're folded in a weird way. All of these animals that we think of, the paradigmatic, the iconic animals that you grow up as children, you show your children, they all live in Africa. And they live in these parks with virtually no protection. The money that's coming in from photo tourism is hardly enough, only in a few places. Sport hunting, no. It's just not happening, okay? So we can say, Wildlife cannot pay its own way. That's not an option. It's not working. We've had 50 years to figure that out, and the answer is clear. It ain't working. So what do? I think we have to talk to the grown-ups, and we have to recognize that this is a world heritage beyond a particular site, beyond a particular habitat. These species are iconic. If we can't look after these species, what the hell can we look after? Okay? But there are organizations that have the kind of funding that could do it. There is the United Nations Environmental Program. There is UNESCO. If they could distribute some money out to these places, it would make a difference. Okay? If we look at the remaining lion range, the great thing about Africa, even though these challenges are horrific, is that there are huge wildlife areas that are still extant. They're still intact. There are a number of places where there's still more than 1,000 lions in a single ecosystem. Okay? For tigers, forget it. There's 3,000 left across all of Asia, and a big population might be 75. Okay? But in Africa, we got places that still have 1,000 lions. Like the Selous, that red circle over there in southern Tanzania, it's the size of Switzerland. There's the Serengeti Mara, it's the size of New Hampshire. Kruger is the size of New Jersey, and a much more interesting place to be. And Okavango and Chobe's like Massachusetts. I mean, these are big areas, okay? And they still function. Now, the total remaining range for the lion, this is this green stuff now on this map, is about 1.2 million square kilometers. And if we say, let's start out with the 2,000 per square kilometer management budget required to protect them, what we're talking about then is about $2.5 billion a year. Okay? There's a shortfall of about $2 billion. That's how far off we are. It's way off. Okay? So we need to get outside help. We need to have the world's involvement in all this. And there are more ways than just the environmental segment. Wildlife is a vital engine for economic growth and poverty alleviation in a lot of these countries in Africa. I've talked with the World Bank and some of their representatives, and whenever you talk about an economic activity that contributes more than 1 to 2% of GDP, it's worth knowing about. People need to know. People need to be nurturing these. If we look at the proportion of GDP across these African countries, Namibia, 20% of its GDP comes from tourism. And they're coming there to see wildlife. Kenya, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, all above 10%. Okay? Even South Africa, which is one of the most industrialized countries in the continent, nearly 8%. Okay? So this is substantial. This is worth putting into the calculations of how one aids these countries, how it assists in their development. So, we need to be talking to the World Bank. We need to be talking to IMF. They'll put money into it. It's just a matter of it becoming a priority, being brought to their attention. It could happen. Okay? And again, I just want to go back and remind you one more time. It's a situation to do with poverty. Okay? These people in southern Tanzania that we talked to, who lost children and loved ones to lions, they're subsistence farmers. They are so poor. They know there are man-eating lions there, yet they sleep in these terrifying platforms at the time of year when they know that man-eating is most likely to occur, because they might be attacked by a lion, true, but they know for sure if they don't protect their crop, the bush pigs will come and they'll destroy it. And they'll lose their seed for next year. They'll lose their livelihood for this year. So it's no surprise with sugarcane farmers in India that, yeah, we're going to keep those tigers out. In pastoralist areas, they can be devastating. This is one lion killed about 20 different sheep in one night. Devastating for this family. So it's no surprise people will spend the few pennies they have on rat poison to get rid of them. It's poverty, it's poverty, it's poverty that makes people so incredibly vulnerable. People who are as wealthy as we are don't live in those kinds of platforms. They don't walk around literally in bare feet with lions that want to eat their livestock. So we have to recognize that this is an issue not just of conservation, but it's also of poverty and of human well-being as well. Finally on this is to notice that much of what I just described, with those terrible crops that people are growing on pennies a day, one crop of rice, one crop of maize, a few goats. If agricultural practices could be improved, this would make an astonishing difference to the future of that whole continent. If we look at the population trends at a continental scale, we've got Latin America in red, South Asia in blue, Southeast Asia in green, and Sub-Saharan Africa in purple. Africa is the last place on earth where we have literally unfettered human population growth. And we know that this is a sign of poverty. Every continent on the planet, once people reach a certain level of economic development, of public health, family size drops off. And we're seeing that everywhere except Africa. We also know that there will be a certain amount of economic development even in Africa, and that if we extrapolate recent trends, East Africa could, within the next 50 years, catch up in their GDP compared to these other continents. But that's going to bring problems too, because wealthier countries have higher protein diets, they have much more reliance on high energy input kinds of foods to feed their livestock, to feed everybody. So if we look at the food demand that we're expecting to see over the next 50 years, Africa is in a league of its own. Africa's food requirement is going to be phenomenal, okay, by its population and whatever level of GDP improvement they can have. Now what this means is, if you look across the planet, that Africa is the place that's going to face horrific risks of extinction in its large mammals. So each country is color-coded there according to the proportion of its wildlife that it's expected to go extinct if the status quo is maintained, because in those countries in red and in dark brown, that's where eventually they're going to need more land than they have as surface area in their country. Every square inch is going to have to be dedicated to agriculture if the same poor agricultural practices are employed in the future as they are today. There's a lot of things that we don't like about industrial scale agriculture, but it's incredibly efficient. It takes up a lot less land, and the reality is, if the yield gap in Africa and the rest of the world declines because people also improve their efficiencies in the same way that we have, that threat goes away. Those populations may not be as well off as we think by this particular graph, but they're doomed if there's no change. Absolutely doomed. There's not enough land in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, et cetera, to feed everybody. Agricultural practices must be improved. So, again, we need to be working with large organizations. USAID puts in billions of dollars in Africa, and a lot of the programs, especially under the Obama administration, has exactly been at improving food production, to try to get rid of that yield gap so that people can get more food, taking up less land, so there's more land set aside still for the wildlife and not under the plow. And FAO is another big organization on this that could be involved. I've tried to list these people. These are the kinds of connections we need to be talking to. These are the kinds of people with billions of dollars who can tackle the looming threat. Now, I've mentioned Cecil, and I just want to say that in the beginning of September, I participated in a workshop at Oxford, because Cecil was a study animal of my colleagues at the Wildlife Conservation Research Institute there. And this was covered, the outcome of the meeting was covered by BBC Wildlife this last month. The director of Wild Crew said that this meeting was an opportunity to break the mold of lion conservation, to transform the Cecil moment into the Cecil movement. What he's talking about there is that when Jimmy Kimmel found out about Walter Palmer, the dentist, and Cecil, he basically wept on camera, and he pleaded with his viewing audience to help whatever they could with the research group in Oxford. And the Oxford University server crashed because there were 2 million people who tried to get onto it, okay? And so this was like the viral story that month. It was everywhere. But like viral stories, it faded away. So it shows the potential interest, the potential passion that people feel for these kinds of problems. But it also illustrates the challenge of harnessing that energy. Now, at the Cecil meeting, one of the attendees there was the currently Minister for Department of International Development of the British government. And he rather amazingly said, because we were telling, I basically presented the same stuff to him as I did to you. And in response to that, he in a public meeting said, we're committed to spending about $12 billion this year on international development. We need to find projects that we can explain to the public. My instinct is that saving 1.2 million kilometers of lion habitat in Africa would be one of those projects. This is a guy with billions, okay? That's right. That's the right scale of things. And that's just the Brits, okay? And that's 12 billion they have every year, you know? So this is big money, and this is the scale it's going to require. And then I yabbered on, and I said, we're seeking to do something that will cost billions of dollars every year forever. 1.2 million kilometers of lion habitat is an enormous estate that brings with it enormous expenses. But if we can conserve lions, we conserve the plants, plant-eating animals, the other carnivores. We deliver natural capital benefits such as carbon sequestration. So that's what I'm trying to say. All these big species that we think of, they're all in Africa. They're all in the same boat. So what I'm asking for basically boils down to this. It's the T word that voters hate to hear, but just know what it is. A global tax to conserve African wildlife, okay? Our population here is nearly 600 million people. In Europe, it's another 750 million people, okay? So that's a fair number of people, and we're reasonably well-to-do, okay? And that would be about $1.50 a year. That's what we're talking about. If everybody would be willing to allow these governments, which do good things, okay, to set aside $1.50 each for something like this, that's all we're talking about, okay? So this is the sort of thing I'm advocating. This is why I wanted to have the opportunity to come to talk to you. I've been making similar things elsewhere. What can we do as individuals? What I would like is, as you leave here, to think about it in a new way, to reframe the conservation. We all might have our favorite conservation NGO, but they can't shoulder the burden. They can't deal with billions of dollars. It's a big deal when they do something that's $100,000, $20,000. We need billions, okay? They could be great partners once the funding comes in to really protect these areas, but they can't do it by themselves. It's just not going to work. The natural world is our world, so we all have to help. We love lions, but we don't live with the risk of lions. If we want there to be lions, we should share the responsibility. So yell, okay? I've talked about Cecil a bit. I just want to tell you one last little story, which is that I went to Washington on a fairly regular basis trying to get them to reform sport hunting regulations. And they weren't terribly interested in me. They didn't think I had anything interesting to say or it was going to help them in any way until last year. And I went in to see them. It was in August of last year. And they said, oh, Dr. Packer, please come in. We really want to talk to you. And I said, really? Yeah. So, what is it we should do? And I said, well, this would be good, that would be good. And then after the meeting was over, I said, well, I suspect you kind of been under a lot of pressure lately. And they said, yeah, we got 34,000 emails about Cecil. 34,000 emails about Cecil got those new rules in. The lion is the one and only species now that the restrictions for importing a sport-hunted trophy into the U.S. are the strictest that have ever been attempted. And it's all because of Cecil. So if people yell and they've got a good cause and they've got a sensible solution, people will listen. Well, they did. This administration listened. Which brings me to the last one. Yes. Look, I don't care how depressed you are. Within 2 years, we get to vote again, okay? So don't give up. Keep heart, and I thank you.
Now it's your turn, and just put up your hand, Becky, and I will get to you. We have a question right here in the front.
Hi. Well, first of all, I loved what you had to say. I have spent a certain amount of time in the bush in South Africa and Mozambique and East Africa, mostly Tanzania, mostly in the small parks you said. And one of the reasons I love Tanzania more than others is because of the open parks there, no fencing, the migrations. And I see the challenge you're talking about in putting up the fencing. I'm wondering whether you or any of your colleagues have done any modeling, predictive modeling around the effects of on the ecosystem of fencing the lions on the migration and on the other species, what this would mean.
Yeah, well, the closest thing that's come to that, and it's really a different situation than I would ever advocate, was there's been talk of putting a road across the Serengeti. And so some colleagues of mine have modeled what would happen if there was not only a road, but a barrier that stopped the migration from crossing that highway. And so the consequences of that would be pretty profound, but nobody I know wants to no wildlife biology would want to do that. That was purely for transportation of goods, et cetera, et cetera. The thing about modeling that sort of thing is I think it's probably enough at this point just to look to see if the land next to a park is largely occupied by pastoralists. And as a rule of thumb, pastoralists live in arid climates, and everybody moves around a lot, and so does the wildlife move around sort of at the same place. So you wouldn't want to fence any of the pastoralist areas. So as a shortcut or a shorthand, what I always say is if it's agricultural land, and you can view some of these boundaries from space already, that it's cotton fields, it's maize fields, right up to the park boundary, and that's where you should put the fence, is agriculture. And so when I was talking about you wouldn't want to put a fence around Tarangire, absolutely not. You wouldn't. But there is actually one stretch around Tarangire that's all fields, and you could fence that little portion. And like around the Serengeti, that's a really nice, complicated example because it's migratory on the east side, and it's agriculture on the west, and the fence should be on the west side, but not on the east. So agriculture, yes. Livestock, no.
Question in the center here.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have a naive question. Your numbers at the end were mostly predicated on saving or preserving the entire population of lions in Africa,
yeah.
Which seems a laudable goal, but could you make the conservation argument against allowing the population to decline, say, in part? Why do we have to preserve all of them at such a cost?
No, that's a good point, and I'm just trying to outline the scale of the problem, and triage may be necessary. And in fact, that 1.2 million square kilometers, that's my colleagues at Panthera have come up with that. I would be happy just to keep those 5 places, Switzerland, New Hampshire, those places. I think those are the most critically important to me. So I would definitely advocate triage, for sure.
Question in the center here.
I understand that some of us still believe in climate change,
I've heard that, yeah.
and that I think I've heard that Africa may be the most impacted of any of the continents with climate change. Could you comment?
So far, what's happened with climate change in Africa is not so much an overall trend, but greater unpredictability. So Africa is very sensitive to the El Nino, La Nina cycle. And what happens is that with La Nina, You tend to have droughts in East Africa and floods in South Africa. With El Nino, it's the other way around. And as the El Nino system is getting more intense, those swings are getting wilder. And so, yeah, I just left climate change out of this because I'd get too depressed. But again, with some of these areas that are so huge, it's not like, I don't think there's any way around it, that there's going to be changes. It's going to be a change in the rainfall regime, kind of like you have here in California, but again with these swings between droughts and floods. And I have shifted because I'm no longer allowed to work in Tanzania, but I do work in South Africa now, and they've just come off one of their worst droughts in a dozen years, and before that it was the worst drought in 50 years, but they're just coming that much more common. And it's going to be tough, and it's probably going to affect the overall carrying capacity of these animals, so everything will probably become scarcer.
I have a question. One of the reasons that you got in so much trouble in Tanzania, I think, was because you spoke out against government corruption. And I know you didn't mention that today, so would you care to enlighten us?
Yeah, so the reality of Africa is it's a mess. I'm just thinking about how Kenya and now Tanzania, oddly enough, you seem to have countries that are run by a few billionaires. Yeah, it's bad. The other thing I didn't really talk about tonight, but is hopeful, is that not every country is as corrupt as Tanzania. It breaks my heart that Tanzania is so corrupt because I worked there for over 40 years, and I love the country dearly, but the cynicism of the government officials there is just breathtaking. But they have a real problem in that the population now is about 50 million people. And Botswana, which is not quite as big as Tanzania, has a population of 3 million people. And Namibia, which is almost as big, again, has about 1 million people. And so in these countries that are empty, there's a lot more hope. They're not only less corrupt to begin with, there's just much less pressure on the land. And I think that our best hope for some of these countries is to look at our own history, to look at the history of Europe. I don't know how many of you ever saw the film The Gangs of New York, but the gangs in New York described a horrifically corrupt culture in this country. And there was a period of time in this country where the fire department would set fire to your house, and you had to pay them to put out the fire that they just started, right? And that's kind of how it is in Tanzania and Kenya, Nigeria. I could go on. And how we got out of that is going to be a valuable lesson for those countries. A lot of agencies are trying to shortcut that process towards greater government accountability and greater transparency, et cetera, et cetera. And it's tough to speed it up. What seems to have happened in America and Europe was the growth of a really large middle class. And once people are educated, then they tend not to fall for this sort of stuff. They also pay taxes. And once you pay taxes, you do demand more accountability from your government. So there's a positive feedback loop that comes into account. And Africa just hasn't reached that. These countries are so incredibly poor that most people don't pay taxes, so the government feels no obligation to give them any services. So people don't want to pay taxes, so it just goes, it spirals outward. So until that's overcome, it's really hard. And so when I talk about a global tax, I mean, one triage would be which areas are most important ecologically. Another one would be which countries could you trust to do something like that. And so in my discussions with various people on this, it's like, okay, let's start at Namibia. And then people can look at that, and then Botswana might join, and then maybe another country will join, and you say, this is it, you know? And hopefully it would spread that way. It's not going to happen all at once. It's a process.
We'll take one last question. Go ahead.
Down here in the right.
Pete, thank you for your very interesting talk. I had a question about the incoming stepfather's tendency to kill all the cubs. I would have thought that a mammalian female would try to protect her cubs. Does the lioness not do anything to stop the massacre?
Yes, she does. There's various things that females do, not least is the fact that they live in prides. And so in the pride, sisterhood is powerful, and 3 or 4 females can gang up on a male and protect their cubs. But if a new male has come in and he's going to stick around, he'll just wear them out eventually. The females will fight it, and they'll do their best. And they'll die in the defense of their cubs occasionally. But once the cubs are gone, it's like, okay, I can't cry over spilt milk. I just got to go forward. And at that point, it actually, rather shockingly, the best thing for them to do is to mate with an infanticidal male, because then their sons will be infanticidal and they'll be more successful than others who lose their cubs. So it's an interesting system. Up until the minute they lose their cubs, they don't like it. They might try to hide them somewhere, take them somewhere else. They'll fight. If the male overpowers them or is able to find their cubs and kill them, then okay, you'll do. I mean, great. And they'll mate with them.
So I want to remind you, we have a book signing. Please join us in the atrium. Thanks to all of you for being here tonight. Craig Packer, Dr. Packer, thank you so very much.